Hello and welcome to the next session of Need to Know British Cultural Studies, which is number 10, and our topic for today is Gender, the Data of Biology. Let us first take a short look at the context and gender studies in general. So, if we are asking what gender studies is about, then we could say it is the study of the division of humans into men and women. And it's usually that binary distinction, but it also goes beyond this binary distinction. And one of the main questions is, okay, how are these categories, so men and women, represented in society? What is used to portray them? How do people behave? How do they represent their gender in society? And what we have to keep in mind here is that representation is always linked to construction of norms and discourse. So basically, how people behave in society shapes those gender roles. We will come back to that in the next session on performativity, but this is also important for why is this division important, not only as this is nature. I mean, we will discuss why this is not really just nature today, but it's important to keep in mind that there are also a lot of norms and culturally specific discourses that go along with the gender roles. And so we could, in full, say that gender studies is about the social and also cultural logic, origin, and structures and consequences of this binary distinction. Also about the developments in the area, and also tries to look at gender frameworks from new perspectives and also questions the binary distinction that we have. Now, let's have a look at a few names who are associated with gender studies. And yeah, you can read them for yourselves. And what will be, maybe if you have read about some of them, maybe something that you stumble upon is that they are actually not associated with gender studies in general, but rather with subfields and also with different topics within the whole area of gender studies. And this is why I decided to also have a look at areas and academic disciplines that are associated with gender studies, which would, for example, be feminism, masculinity studies, and queer studies. So basically, you can have very different focus points within gender studies, and this is still related to this field of study. And what I would say is that gender studies is actually somewhere between activism, tries to look at biology as well, and also philosophy. So trying to really have a perspective on, okay, what does this distinction of men and women mean? How is it represented? What are the consequences? And can we maybe also question this to make the world more inclusive and not exclusive as it is at the moment? The first aspect that I want to discuss is a basis, and this is why I called it a basic distinction. The question marks is something that you will understand in a second. The first term that is important here is sex, not in the sense of reproductive activity, but rather in the sense of biologically category of distinction. So basically, the bodily features of a human being, genitals, and also hormones and everything that has to do with the body is seen as determining this person's sex. So a biological category that can be male or female and describes which sex you have. And then there's gender. Gender is seen as the social or cultural category. So basically, representation and behavior of a certain gender role. Now, this seems pretty clear. Sex is biology, gender is what culture makes of it. But it's actually not that simple because biology is interlinked with the behavior. So if you say that a person has certain bodily features and then certain brain structures as well, because that would be biology in a way, then this would affect the behavior of a person. And then also it's important to keep in mind that the behavior affects the body. A simple example maybe, if I go to the gym every day and have this behavior, then my body will be severely affected because I will be a very muscular person. I'm not, but this is like this principle. Whatever you do in your life, what you eat, how you behave, how you move your body, it affects your biological features. It makes your muscles grow and it makes your appearance, your biological or bodily appearance, very distinct. And this means that gender and sex are absolutely interlinked and can't be that clearly distinguished from each other sometimes. Important is also that gender and sex of a person are not necessarily congruent. So basically, a person that has been assigned the male sex at birth must not necessarily behave in the masculine gender role. It can very well be that this person at some point in life realizes, gender-wise, I actually don't feel like I should use the gender that is associated with the male sex, but I should rather go into another direction. And then this person would be not sex gender congruent, but really somewhat different. And then, of course, the whole categories would be less clear cut and more differentiated, nuanced. So what we can get from that is that the whole picture of sex, gender, is much more complex than this binary suggests. And why this is the case and what aspects within we can look at will be the main topic of today's session. Now let's have a look at some important terms because I already mentioned some of these terms and I think it's very good if you have an overview. I have actually no idea in which order the words will appear, so let's just have a look. Sex. I already explained this is the biological category, and here we have this distinction in male and female. We can also have a person that is transsexual. This means that something with the body of the person has happened, so that, for example, gender affirming surgery. So it's about the body that has changed here. And we can have intersex. This would be people where the bodily features are not binary and where the bodily features are basically between male and female or somewhere on a spectrum. And then gender is the second one, okay? Here we have masculinity and femininity and this now is important, it's oriented towards the sex distinction, so male, female, and then we have masculinity and femininity as the categories. So you can, for example, be a masculine male or a feminine male. That would be possible. Also, transgender would be the category that agrees with transsexual. Transgender would, however, not be a person that has necessarily had, transgender doesn't describe surgical interventions. It just describes that a person does not have the same gender role as the sex which was assigned at birth would suggest. So this would, for example, be a person which has been assigned the male sex but behaves in a completely different gender role, not only in the sense of this person behaves like somewhat feminine, but rather really embraces femininity and portrays themselves as a feminine person. And then we also have diverse and non-binary gender. Important here that it's about diverse and non-binary gender. So this would be categories that don't fit into this masculinity and femininity distinction, more or less similar to intersex, but intersex usually does not necessarily align with diverse and non-binary gender. Intersex people are usually assigned one sex at birth, so an intersex person is very likely to become a male or female through surgical intervention, or just because people say, okay, this seems more prevalent, so I will just say that this person has this sex, and then they will be assigned a gender role in society. Then something that is in between or combines both categories would be a cis person. A cis person has one sex and has the same or has been assigned one sex at birth and then fulfills the gender role that agrees with it. So if you have were assigned the female sex at birth, which is the case in my case, for example, then I have this gender and then I portray this gender role of femininity and feel myself also as a woman in society. This would then be my social role as well. Then this would be a cis person. A trans man or trans woman is somewhat of a distinct category to me because it can be based on transgender only, but it can also include a transsexual person. So trans man and trans woman would mean that a person is basically transgressing to the other gender role, so having been assigned a certain sex at birth and then transgressing to the other gender, but it does not describe whether there has been surgical intervention or not. So trans man and trans woman describes person has transgressed to the other gender role, but you can't really distinguish whether it's transsexual or transgender, and so this category is not really explicated by that, but it can be used to describe both. Queer would also be something that is in between. It can be related to sex, it can be related to gender, it's just somewhere in between and describes gender and sex roles which are different from, or gender roles which are different and also transgresses into sex. And then we also have everyday categories that combine both. So if we talk about a girl, about a boy or a man or a woman, or also about gender roles like mother or father, we usually expect that sex and gender in a way combine and we have congruent categories. And then there's one term that I included because it might be a bit of confusion. Sexuality would then not be the biological role or biological distinction, but this would be the preferences in relationships. So it's something different, but also related somehow. And here we would have hetero, homo, or bi, or whatsoever. We do have many distinctions here. But if you have something like that, it has nothing to do with the sex that has been assigned or the gender role, but this would then go into the direction of sexuality. lengthy explanation, and I'm sorry about that, but I think it might be helpful when you basically have other texts and all those categories are used. But this would be the basic distinction and the basic terminology for describing gender and sex in cultural studies. Now, on this slide, I want to talk about gender essentialism. There will be some aspects that we have talked about before and that I've mentioned before, but let's have a look. The claim of gender essentialism is that there's some essence that determines humans to be men and women. So a category that combines both sex and gender role. And here we would basically have this idea of a feminine and female and masculine and male essence. So there's something about human beings that makes them really have this congruency and also just behave and be in those categories. And it said that this essence determines and also justifies the positions of men and women in society. So because you were born with this sex, you have this gender and behave like that, and this is because of that you have a certain position in society, would be the claim of gender essentialism. And biology is usually used as a basis for these claims. So bodily features, genitals and hormones, for example, would be said to distinguish people into males and females, and then having the congruent and just similar gender categories. And it is said that these features, so the bodily features, coincide with mental and physical capabilities. That might sound familiar from race and racism, because the racialized idea is as well that you have certain physical features, in that case skin color. Now here it's about the genitals and also the hormones a person has, and that those features coincide with mental and physical capabilities. And we do have research related to this, which then would be sex difference research. And we'll have a look at that in a second. Sex difference research looks into empirically significant differences in the psychology and behavior of men and women. A straightforward example may be empathy and emotion versus logical thinking and rationality. One of these is associated with men, the other with women. And then it would be research would mean that we look into which of these categories can be assigned to one of the sex and gender roles, and how does this distinguish people, and then why would that support the claim that there is an essence. And another distinction would be dolls versus cars, and I think that you are familiar with which would be assigned to which. And so sex difference research tries to explain these differences in preference or in mental capacities or psychology or whatever with biological traits. An example would be evolutionary psychology. It would claim that the differences derive from evolution and natural selection. So it would be said that dolls versus cars, in the sense of some humans are more interested in caring and caring for others and playing babies, whereas other humans are more interested in cars, so technical stuff which requires logical thinking and mathematical skill, and also is less associated with caregiving, but rather with action, for example. Then it would be claimed that these differences derive from evolution because women were always more caring and always basically supposed to care for the children, whereas men were supposed to do other tasks and to represent and protect the family. And this would then be claimed that this shapes how people behave nowadays. What is important here is, however, that we have a contextuality of this adaptation. So yes, humans adapt to their contexts, but they adapt to the context, and the context is not worldwide similar, but rather very different. And this is all also based on assumptions about a past in a very, very, very distant past, and nobody actually knows how the people like a million year like I actually have no idea when this time when evolution would set on was, but so way back is a time that nobody can access. Nobody knows how that would have been. We can also only just assume what people or roles for people would have been like way back. And what is also important is that behaviors are shaped in social interaction to a great deal. So what is notable is that if you try to raise a child without like physical contact, without giving care to that child, this person can't care for others. It can learn that maybe in social interaction, but those basic traits are set through social interaction with like the parents or other persons who replace the roles of the parents. But it's basically not shaped through this is just there and humans just develop in that way, but rather in social interaction. So we can't say that empathy is something that is just innate to women, but rather something that develops. And so some examples that underline these like but claims is that we do have different adaptation in other species and humans. So depending on where a person comes from, or also going into the direction of animals, where another species comes from, it adapts to the surrounding. And a human which grew up in a European environment is maybe very different from a human that grew up in an Asian environment. So there are great differences depending on the context. And there were also experiments on babies who grew up without human care, and then exactly what I described before happened. They just couldn't cope in society because they were not used to social interaction and behavior in the sense of sociability. So this would be sex difference research. Another area of research related to gender essentialism is brain research. And yeah, I found you this wonderful picture, which I find more or less wonderful because it claims that you have the male and female brain and that they are very distinct and that they have different connectivities, basically, which are signified by those blue lines. And yes, I mean, this picture claims that we have a difference and that men are better at this and women are better on that based on their brains. And so this would actually try to support this essentialist notion of brains are different, the biological features are different, and this is why we have men and women. Now, yes, research did find differences in the size and also in developed areas of brains. This research would be more in the direction of developed areas. But the question now would be, does this actually validate this essentialist claim? And yeah, well, no, it doesn't. Because body size and brain mass actually coincide. So a taller person, this person just does have more brain mass because it's a taller person. But this doesn't mean that this person has more mental capacities, because it doesn't mean that this brain is used more efficiently. And then there's something we call neuroplasticity. And this is something that I want you to keep in mind because it's very important. Like muscles, the areas of the brain which are used more often grow. So basically, if you think, or if you are supposed to think very logical all the time, then you will become better at logical thinking. You can also use this like short sentence of neurons that fire wire. So wherever you have neurons in your brain that are used more often, then you basically have like a motorway developing because the neurons are just getting more used to it, then there are more synapses, and the brain is just much more developed in an area that is used more often than in one that is not used very often. And now, what's important is here, if a person is treated in a certain way, that doesn't only have an effect on how that person behaves, maybe, but it actually makes their brain structures develop accordingly. So if a person is all the time required to think in a certain way, the brain will reflect that in the brain structures. And so these differences that we see in that wonderful picture, coming back to the picture, must not necessarily be something that has been there from birth. Now, this was an awful lot of theory, and I want you to have a moment to think about this question. In what ways are humans treated differently that may have an effect on gendered brain development? Maybe stop the video for a moment and think about the question and then return to the video once you have done so. Now, I think that you have thought about things, and yeah, something that I would mention here would be expectations. So think about what would be expected from a certain person with regard to their gender role, and then how does this maybe have an effect? Also, activities that are encouraged within some people and or some with encouraged within one gender role, not in the other. Also, the question of appropriate toys or clothes, role models and norms. So these would be areas where people are treated differently based on their gender and also on their sex in a way, because this is connected, as we said. And so people would develop different brain structures if they're treated differently here. Even though this already sounds complicated enough, there's more complexity to this. And this is what I would call the cultural aspect in natural sciences. Now, maybe think back to Selective Tradition by Raymond Williams. So basically that throughout history, certain aspects, for example, scientific truths, were valued more than others, and that certain selected perspectives were chosen to, just be used over the ages, and certain other aspects and perspectives were basically dismissed as not being the true or valid perspective. So we do have a certain selection in science, for example. And this would mean that our raw facts, so basically scientific truths, are always mediated by prominent discourses. So what can be seen as true or false at a certain time, also the terminology that is used. These are prominent and sometimes hegemonic discourses So these raw facts and scientific truths would be somewhat related to certain perspectives and not be this is the ultimate truth. Also by confirmation bias. This means that expectations derived from existing models. So if I have a certain idea about what is something supposed to look like, what is my expectation, and this shapes the outcomes of studies because I will be very, very likely to look at what I expect rather than what is the unknown. I do not have an objective thinking and objective research. So if a researcher has the expectation to find binary differences when researching gender, then it is very hard to interpret the findings otherwise, like in the picture above. So if I told you this is a drinking cup or glass, then you would see that. And if I told you first that those are two faces, then you're very likely to see the two faces first. So it is one of those optical illusions where you can see two things, but if you are told that, or if you have a certain expectations what this will be like, then you're very likely to not see the other, but only see what you expect. This would be confirmation bias. So this is why we do have a very, very significant influence of culture and of how humans think of cognitive aspects that are related to prominent discourses in the natural sciences and also in gender research. Let's try to summarize this a little bit. We can say that both sex and gender as categories are inherently connected and culturally influenced. There is no simple biology in sex because biology is always just a discourse that has developed in a culture. So it is always culturally influenced. And then there are two things that we can't say in the approach we are following in cultural studies. The first thing is we can't say that gender is only a constructed category with no biological grounding in the sense of the body is unimportant. We can also not say that gender is a biologically determined category, so we cannot also not say that gender essentialism exists. But we are working somewhere on the middle ground, and this middle ground would be called new materialism. It would claim that gender and sex are culturally determined, the culturally determined way that humans make sense of their body, or how humans make sense of their individual bodily features with regard to sexual or sex or gender difference. So the body is super important, central to the concept, but the body doesn't determine everything. It's rather about how is the body interpreted. And it is important to say that new materialism claims that nature's possibilities, so basically the body as basis, provides more potential meanings than the binary would suggest. So if we have this binary distinction of man and women, and we look at the bodies with that in mind, of course, you basically see those binaries. But if you try to look without this binary in mind, then it's very possible to distinguish into more gender or sex categories. Now, before I close this session, I want to have an application task for you. And I'm sorry because the bullet points appear in the wrong order, so I'll just have to look at when the question is the last thing to appear. The question would be, where in lives are people actively gendered, and how does this facilitate developments of culturally specific gendered habits? And some examples would be gender reveal parties. You also have a picture of a gender reveal party right next to the text. This is basically a social gathering where people or parents to be, announce the sex and they say they announce the gender of an unborn child. And now this means that basically everybody in that family and everybody that is there knows that this child is basically determined by the biological features is male or female, and then the gender category is basically taken and the child is seen as boy or girl. And then this means that from that moment on, from the moment people think they know the gender, or so they do know the sex more or less, it's more or less reliable, but they know the sex, and then they decide, okay, now we know the gender because we basically treat that child from before being born as it's going to be a boy or it's going to be a girl, and then treat it in a gender specific way. It starts with colors, rose color and blue, but it translates to much more than just colors. But actually there are differences in how people treat boys and girls, gendered human beings. Something that I also think important here, think back to Foucault's examination, the connection of observation or hierarchical observation and judgment. People are constantly looking at each other and judging, okay, does this mean? So basically, we look at people and judge, okay, male, female, masculine, feminine, and so we judge gender all the time. And this is combined with infra and micro penalty. Infra penalty as the social expectations and network of norms, and micro penalty, the penalties or measurements that enforce these norms. So if the infra penalty would, for example, be girls don't wear shorts, but girls rather wear skirts. And you see a girl that is wearing shorts, and this girl is looked at like very frowning and skeptically. This girl will notice. And because this girl in a way might violate the norm then, and it would be treated that way. It would receive micro penalties ranging from weird looks to someone saying, this is not appropriate. And then this person, the girl that we have in our example here, would be judged, then treated with micro penalty measurements, and then it would probably change their behavior because the person would be like, okay, I'm doing something wrong here. I want to adapt because I want to be in society, not violate society all the time to just be excluded. Something else, interpellation. Think about advertisement and gendered advertisement, and also how this is used in society in general. So we do have those addresses to men, to women, to boys, to girls, to gendered human beings all the time. And this, of course, shapes the subject positions that people can have in society. It shapes the identity. And we can also say that gender is, in a way, an institutionalized practice. So if I think back to some of my primary school internships, I do very well remember that we had, at one hand, sex education, on the other hand, just like in second grade or so, very basic ideas about, okay, what does it mean to be a girl or a boy? And then if we have sex education, the class is split. The class is split into biological sexes. And then people are basically in those groups and learn something group specific. So people are treated differently within this institution of school, of primary school actually, and basically receive a gendered education with respect to some aspects. Also that, for example, it's forwarded that boys are good in mathematics and that girls are very good in languages, for example. So it's also seen that if a girl or boy would outperform others in the field that this person is not supposed to be good at, so if a boy was really good at languages, or if a girl was extremely good at maths, then this person would be valued differently than if this person was the other gender. So a girl that's good at maths is likely to be seen as an exception and is to be valued as an exception, even though this person is just good at maths. And if it were a boy, it wouldn't be seen as so much of an exception because the gender role would be, okay, boys are naturally good at maths. So we would have these institutionalized practices of what is expected and how are people treated accordingly. So this is basically some ideas for application, and you can definitely find examples on your own. Have a look at your surroundings, and maybe you just try to walk through your city or town or village or wherever you're at the moment with open eyes and try to see, okay, where are people treated differently? How is this maybe also related to examination, observation, infra and micro penalty? And can you maybe see interpellation, addresses which are gendered, not only in advertisement, but also maybe in society in general? And this concludes the session, and I am extremely sorry because I just noticed that I did not update the sources. So this means that I will give you the sources below the video on YouTube. I'm very sorry, but yeah, with that note, I want to say thank you for listening, and I hope that you could take something from the session, and see you next time.